The lamb in my arms had stopped shivering, which was the wrong kind of quiet. A lamb that shivers is fighting. A lamb that goes still has made a decision, and not the one you want. I pressed her against my chest, under my Carhartt, and tried to count the others by the thin orange glow of the propane torpedo heater in the corner. The one that was still lit. The second one had guttered out 20 minutes ago, when the wind found a gap in the barn wall I hadn't known was there. The power had gone at 9:17. I knew the exact time because I'd been standing at the breaker box when it happened, watching the barn lights die all at once like something exhaling. It was 2:07 in the morning now, April 15th, and the thermometer nailed to the center post read, -6. I counted 14 lambs down on the straw. Not dead, I didn't think any were dead yet, but flattened out in that low, boneless way that means the cold has gotten into them far enough that they've stopped trying to stand. Their mothers circled and nudged and made the low sound ewes make, that sound somewhere between a question and a complaint. 300 lambs, born in the last 3 weeks of March. 300 lambs and the single worst night Carbon County had seen in April in 30 years. The wind hit the barn wall, and the whole structure groaned. A long wooden complaint that I felt in my back teeth. I'd been told in August by a heavy-set man in a brown suit sitting across a desk in Rawlins that an operation this size needed at least 2 experienced hands. He'd said it the way men say things they believe are kindnesses. Leaning back, fingers laced over his stomach, voice carrying the mild patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone young. Not one girl, just out of school. He had a loan balance figure in front of him. $47,200. A payment due June 1st. $9,800. He pushed the paper toward me like evidence. I had driven home 7 miles down a gravel county road and stood in my grandmother's kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. That was 8 months ago. This was now. I shifted the lamb higher against my chest and felt her twitch, one small, involuntary shiver, and I said something under my breath that wasn't quite a prayer and wasn't quite a curse. The heater hissed. Outside, the wind was running at 35 miles an hour across open high desert, picking up snow and driving it horizontal into every crack and seam. I could hear it working on the barn roof the way water works on stone. Patient, indifferent, thorough. There were 14 lambs on the ground in front of me. There were 286 more in the adjacent pens. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew I was not going to stand still. My grandmother died on August 9th, 9 days after I arrived. I had driven up from Laramie with 2 duffel bags and a feeling I could not name yet. Not dread exactly, but something adjacent to it. The way a room feels different before a storm than during one. She had called me in July and said she needed help with the late season work, and her voice had a particular quality to it, measured and careful, that I recognized later as the voice of a person who is deciding how much to ask for. I did not know it then. I thought she meant a few weeks. I thought I would help with shearing records and fence line and be back in Laramie by September. She died in the upstairs bedroom at 4 in the morning, quietly, the way she had done most things. The county coroner drove out from Rawlins, 7 miles north up the gravel road, and I stood in the yard in the August heat, watching his truck raise a pale column of dust, and I understood for the first time that I was not going back to Laramie. I did not decide this. It was simply true. The loan officer came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, which I remember because the farrier had come the day before and left a bill on the kitchen table I had not yet moved. The loan officer was a heavy-set man in his 50s, the kind of man who fills a room without meaning to, who carries his certainty ahead of him, like a tool he keeps well-maintained. He sat across from me at the table where my grandmother had eaten every meal for 40 years, and he set a folder on the oilcloth, and he opened it with the deliberate patience of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it has become a procedure. He went through the figures without hurry, the remaining balance. $47,200. The next payment, Due June 1st of the following year, $9,800. The history of the account, the collateral assessed, the acreage, 640 acres, a full section, which I already knew because she had walked every corner of it with me once, when I was 11, and told me the name of every pasture. Then he looked across the table at me. Not unkindly. I want to be fair about that. And he said that an operation this size needed at least 2 experienced hands, not one girl just out of school. He said it with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. He was not being cruel. He believed it. I walked him out to his truck and watched him drive north toward Rawlins, and then I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. The house still smelled like her. Coffee and lanolin, and something faint and particular I could never name. I did not cry. I sat down in her chair at the table and I looked at the farrier's bill and I thought, 8 months. I have 8 months to prove that wrong. 8 months. That number held me through October and November and the long flat gray of December, through 2 sick ewes and a broken water line and a feed bill that came in $40 higher than I'd budgeted. It held me through January, when the truck wouldn't start for 4 days, and I had to borrow a neighbor's flatbed to haul hay from Rawlins. It held me through late March, when the lambs started coming fast, 2 and 3 a night, and I slept in the barn more than the house, and learned to read a ewe the way she'd taught me, watching the way they stood and didn't stand. By April 14th I had 300 lambs on the ground, all of them between 17 and 23 days old, most of them strong, a few that had needed extra watching in those first cold nights, but had come through. 310 ewes. The whole flock filling in the lambing barn with that particular smell. Wet wool and lanolin and milk and something alive and warm and pressing that I had come to think of as the smell of everything I was working for. The night came in fast. The radio had set a late-season system, moving down from the north, possible accumulation, wind advisory. Wyoming, in April, I had topped off both propane torpedo heaters in the barn that afternoon, and brought in extra wood for the mudroom stove, and told myself it would be a rough night, and not the first one. The power went at 9:17. I know the exact time because I was standing at the barn door watching the snow come sideways through the beam of the work light when the light died. Just gone. The whole barn went black and silent except for the wind and the sound of the lambs. 18 degrees outside, and the barn walls doing what they could. I stood still for 3 seconds. I counted them. And then I moved. The 2 propane heaters were already lit, and I located them by the blue glow of their pilots. Checked the tanks, both near full. They would hold the barn above freezing for a while, but not indefinitely, and not to 0. And the forecast was going to 0. I knew that. I knew also that lambs pile in cold and dark, crowd into corners and stack on top of each other, and the ones on the bottom suffocate before anyone finds them. I had already seen it once, in a milder, cold snap in February, and lost nothing only because I had been there to break them apart. 300 lambs, 2 propane heaters with a realistic range of maybe 20 feet each, 1 wood stove in the mudroom of the house, 40 yards across a yard that was now invisible inside blowing snow. I stood in the dark and I took inventory, not of what I didn't have, of what I did. 2 heaters, 1 stove, 300 lambs. My hands. The wind hit the north wall of the barn like something solid, and the temperature was still falling. The tack room was at the far end of the barn, past the last pen, and I went there for an extension cord, because I thought I remembered one coiled on the hook near the door. I was moving by feel and lantern light both. The lantern was a small battery camp model, not much, casting a yellow oval that shrank the room down to whatever was in front of me. My hands were already clumsy with cold even inside the gloves, and I knocked something off a shelf reaching for the cord. Heard it hit the floor. Crouched to find it. What my fingers found first was the tin box. I knew what it was before I picked it up Small, rectangular, the lid slightly bowed where it had been stacked under something heavy for a long time. The kind of box that used to hold Christmas cookies or sewing notions, repurposed into something else entirely. I had found it in November by accident, while looking for a spare cinch buckle, and I had found the key at the same time. On a nail behind the feed scale, a small brass key on a loop of wire so ordinary I had nearly thrown it into the parts bucket. I had opened the box once in November, seen the composition book inside, and set it back. I was not ready for it in November. Her handwriting on the cover label, her name, the year, 1958 when she started it. And I had closed the lid and gone back to work. I opened it now. The composition book was green cloth, water-stained along the spine. The pages swelled slightly from years of the barn's damp. I lifted it out by the lantern light, and it fell open near the middle, the way a book falls open to a page that has been turned to many times. The page was torn at the upper right corner, maybe an inch gone, and the handwriting was hers. Small, forward slanting, unhurried. April, 1962. Cold snap came in hard the night of the 14th. Same night, the blizzard took the Halverson place. I read that line twice. Couldn't hold the barn past 15 below with what I had. Moved the newborns through the house in shifts. 12 at a time, 1 hour in the mudroom by the stove, then back to the barn. Tagged each with a strip of orange baling twine so I knew which had been in and which hadn't. Kept the book at the door. Worked all night. Lost 4 that were already gone before I started. Kept the rest. I stayed crouched on the tack room floor with the lantern and the book for a moment that was probably 10 seconds and felt longer. She had done this. On this same night, by the old-style calendar, 62 years before me. She had found the answer with what she had. A wood stove, a mudroom, shifts of 12, orange baling twine, and a book at the door. I looked up at the shelf above me. There was a partial spool of orange baling twine sitting right there. I moved fast, because fast was the only thing I had left. The twine cut easy with my pocket knife. 12 strips, each about 8 inches, looped and knotted so they'd slip over a lamb's neck without pulling tight. I held them in my coat pocket and walked back through the dark to the nearest pen. The propane heater in that section was still running, guttering low, and the lambs closest to it were standing. The ones at the far wall were not. I started with the coldest. You don't carry a lamb the way you'd carry a dog. You tuck them against your body, both arms underneath, their legs hanging, their head against your chest where it's warmest. I took 4 at a time, 2 under each arm, pressed in, and walked them through the side door, across the 12 yards of open ground, between the barn and the house, through the snow that was now mid-shin and still coming, and into the mudroom. The stove was going well by then. I'd loaded it heavy before I found the journal, and the mudroom, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with the stove on the north wall and shelves of boots and drenching equipment along the other, was holding close to 50 degrees. Not warm. Warm enough. I set the first 4 on the rubber mat in front of the stove and went back for the rest of the shift. 4 trips to make 12. Each trip was maybe 90 seconds in the open air. By the 3rd trip, my face had stopped feeling like a face. I wrote in the book at the door, the way she had written, Shift 1. 12 inches. 9:51 p.m. Then I stood in the mudroom and watched them. Some of them were already trying to stand, some weren't. I moved the ones that weren't closer to the stove and stayed with them, my back against the wall, my coat still on, watching their sides for the rise and fall that meant something was still working inside. The math was not good. 300 lambs? 12 per shift. That was 25 shifts. 1 hour each. 25 hours. If everything ran clean, if no shift ran long, if I didn't lose count, if the propane held in the barn and the wood held in the house, and I didn't sit down once. I didn't sit down. At 10:51 I carried the first shift back. Tagged them going in, cut the twine coming out, tucked the orange strips into my coat pocket to reuse. Brought the next 12. Wrote in the book. Shift 2. 12 inches, 10:53 p.m. The propane gauge on the east heater read a third of a tank. I didn't know exactly how long a third of a tank lasted, at -6, with the wind finding every gap in the siding. I knew it wasn't 25 hours. I knew I needed the shifts to move fast enough to outrun that number, and I knew I was already 2 minutes behind my own pace. I went back for the next 12. The wind came in waves. That was the thing about it. Not constant, but rhythmic, almost like breathing, and in the spaces between gusts, the night went very quiet, and I could hear the wood stove ticking as it settled, and the small sounds the lambs made, the soft clicking of their hooves on the mudroom floor, the occasional low murmur that wasn't quite a bleat. It was somewhere near midnight when I sat down, not on purpose. I had come in with the 6th shift, 12 lambs, all tagged, all breathing, the twine orange against their pale wool. And I set the last one down, and my back just found the wall, and I was sitting before I decided to. One of them worked its way into my lap almost immediately, the way they do, seeking warmth without understanding it. I let it stay. I had maybe 8 minutes before I needed to move them back. The lantern was on the shelf above the boot rack. I had been leaving it there between trips so I could find it fast. I reached up and pulled it down and set it beside me, and that was when I thought of the journal. I had tucked it into my coat pocket when I came out of the barn, not thinking, just not wanting to leave it out there in the dark. I pulled it out now, the green cloth cover soft and slightly damp from where it had pressed against me, and I opened it to the middle where I had left off reading weeks ago. The handwriting was small and careful, economy of space. She never wasted a line. I turned a few pages and found the entry about the 1962 cold snap, and read it again, slower this time. At the bottom of the page, below the instructions about the shifts and the orange twine, there was a single sentence I had not paid close attention to before. I read it now in the lantern light with a lamb solid and warm in my lap and wood smoke moving through the small room. The blizzard that took the Halverson place came through the same week. That was all. No explanation of what that meant, no grief written around it. Just the fact, set down plainly, the way she set most things down. But I knew what it meant. The Halverson place was 4 miles east of here, or had been once. There was nothing there now but a collapsed set of corrals and a concrete foundation going back to grass. I had passed it in September without knowing its name. Someone had told me later what it used to be. She had survived this. She had sat somewhere, maybe this floor, maybe a barn floor, colder than this one. And she had moved her lambs through in shifts. And she had written it down so that whoever came after her would know. The lamb in my lap shifted, pressing its chin against my knee. Outside the wind gathered itself again, and the walls of the house held, and I stayed where I was for 1 more minute, just breathing. The lamb went back out at 1:14 a.m. by the clock above the mudroom sink. I tagged it with orange twine, a short strip looped twice around the left rear ankle, and carried it back through the cold hallway and out into the dark, moving fast. The barn door dragged against a drift that had built since midnight. I had to put a shoulder into it. The east corner hit me first. Not the cold exactly, but the quality of it, the kind that has stopped moving, settled, gone still in a way that means something has given out. I had the lantern, and I swept it left, and the first one was already gone. It was lying on its side in the straw, and I knew before I touched it. The second was 3 feet away, the same. I stood there for about 4 seconds, and then I moved to the third, which was still breathing, barely, its sides barely lifting, mouth open and dry. I checked the near propane tank. The gauge needle leaned hard toward empty. The second tank, the backup, read 1/4 full, A quarter was not enough to hold this corner through to morning. I did the arithmetic in my head, and the arithmetic did not come out right. I picked up the fading lamb and held it against my coat and moved toward the heater in the center aisle, closer to the other tank. I did not put it down. I stood there holding it and looked at the remaining lambs in the east pen, 15, 16 of them. And I thought about the house, about the wood stove, about what the journal said. Shifts of 12. I had been running 12. I did not have the luxury of 12 anymore. I started moving lambs, 15 this time. I lined up what I could carry in 2 trips, held 3 inside my coat, carried 2 more under my arm, made the first trip to the house in wind that had picked up again and was throwing ice crystals horizontally off the drifts. By the second trip my face had gone numb on the right side. The mudroom was already close with animals and wood smoke and the smell of wet wool and lanolin, and I fed 2 more splits of wood into the stove and latched it hard and crouched there for a moment, getting feeling back into my hands. The shifts overlapped now. Some lambs were coming in before others had finished their hour. I tagged and retagged, kept count on a torn paper sack I'd found in the mudroom drawer, made marks in pencil. The system was not clean anymore. It had bent. But it was still a system, and a bent system is better than none. The fading lamb I'd carried in first was the one I watched most carefully. It lay near the stove's iron leg, not quite willing to lift its head but breathing evenly now, its sides moving with more intention. I did not know yet if it would make it. I kept moving. The clock on the microwave said 2:04 when I registered it. The green numbers, the only electric light left in the house since the mudroom's overhead, had been on its own circuit and gone out some time before midnight. I know the time because I made myself look, because the journal page had given me a system, and a system needs anchoring, and anchoring needs a number to hold on to. 2 in the morning. -6 outside. I checked the thermometer nailed to the barn door frame on my last crossing, and the mercury had dropped so far it looked embarrassed to be seen. 35 miles an hour of wind still coming down off the basin, still finding the inch of gap under the west barn door and dragging cold air across the floor in a slow, insistent sheet. But the rotation had become its own thing by then. My body knew it. 12 lambs in, 12 lambs out, 1 hour. Orange twine on the ones who'd cycled, no twine on the ones who hadn't. My hands knew the knot. My hands had stopped asking my brain about the knot. They just made it. I'd stopped counting how many I'd lost sometime around 1:30, which was its own kind of shift. You stop accounting for the wrong column and start accounting for the right one. I had marks on the paper sack. 263 so far through the warm room and back to the barn, breathing easy. That was the number I was holding now, not the other one. Exhaustion is not what people think. It isn't blurring or swaying, not at that stage. It's a narrowing. The world reduces to the distance between your hands and the thing your hands need to do next. The gravel floor under my boots. The particular grit of it. Frozen dust and old manure and hay chaff ground down to almost powder in the paths I walked 100 times a day. The iron leg of the stove radiating its dry heat in an 18-inch radius. The smell, lanolin and wood smoke, and the undersmell of wet wool and something almost sweet from the smallest lambs. Something I can only describe as new, the smell of an animal that has not yet been in the world long enough to smell like anything else. My right cheek still wasn't fully right. A deep bone cold, that warmth, hadn't reached yet. I was crouched near the stove, transferring a lamb from my lap to the floor, when I said it aloud to no one. I don't know why. Maybe because the room needed a voice in it that wasn't wind. Cold doesn't kill the careful ones. My grandmother had said it to me my first November here, when I'd found a hypothermic lamb in the far pen and didn't know what to do with my hands. She hadn't made it a lesson. She'd just said it, the way she said most things, like it was already true, and had been true for a long time before she got to it. The lamb near the stove's leg moved its head. The lamb moved its head, and I set it down and stood up. 4 o'clock came, the way it always does in that kind of night. Not as a relief, but as a fact. The darkness outside the mudroom window was the same darkness it had been at midnight, at 2, at 3, except that the wind had dropped a quarter turn, maybe. Just enough that I could hear the propane heaters running in the barn when I opened the door a crack. That steady, low roar, like something breathing. I pulled my coat back on. I did the count with a headlamp, moving aisle to aisle, the beam catching orange twine tags and the wet shine of eyes. I had a running tally going in my head, the way my grandmother had taught me to count, in pairs, grouping what you see into twos so the numbers don't blur. The barn was quieter than it had been at 10, at midnight. The ewes had mostly settled. Lambs were tucked in along flanks, or standing with their legs splayed slightly, the way new ones do, still uncertain of their own weight. I found the 3 before I finished the east aisle. 2 were in the far corner of pen 7, where the wind had found a board gap I hadn't noticed until it was too late. They had been cold before I'd reached that pen in the first rotation, already past the point where warmth would have mattered. I stood over them for a moment with the headlamp pointed at the ground. The third was the one that had come wrong from the start. The small one, born 3 weeks prior, that I had been supplementing, that had never quite found its footing. It was lying near its mother, who was nosing it with the patient, bewildered insistence of an animal that doesn't understand why the thing won't move. 297. I said it once to myself, then walked back to the mudroom. The journal was on the shelf where I'd left it, open to the 1962 page, my grandmother's handwriting in the middle of that torn corner, in pencil gone soft with age. Rotate in 12s, 1 hour, orange twine. The entry was dated April 9th, which meant she had been 23 when she wrote it. 1 year older than I was now. I took the pencil from the shelf. The same pencil, I realized, that had been tucked inside the journal's spine when I'd first opened it. And in the narrow margin beside her entry, I wrote 297, April 15th. Small numbers, even letters. I did not write my name. The page already knew whose handwriting it was. I closed the journal. Outside the dark was beginning to go, not lighter exactly, but thinner. The particular gray that comes before anything else comes. The wind had dropped to something the body could stand. I had not slept. I wasn't ready to yet. The power came back at 6:44 in the morning. I know the exact time because the barn light over the door clicked on, and I was watching it. Had been watching the dark rectangle of the window above the mudroom shelf for I don't know how long, and the sudden yellow square of it made me flinch the way you flinch at a sound in an otherwise silent house. One moment, nothing. Then, light. The refrigerator in the kitchen knocked itself back to life, and the baseboard heater ticked, and somewhere in the barn I heard a ewe shift and resettle the way animals do when something changes in the air around them, even something they cannot name. I pulled on my coat and went outside. The snow had stopped. I don't know when. Sometime in the last hour, I think. While I was sitting with the journal, the world had gone very still and very white and very large all at once. The kind of large that has nothing to do with distance and everything to do with silence. 2 feet of snow had settled across the gravel lot, across the fence rails, across the long, low roof of the lambing barn, and the particular quality of the light coming over the ridge to the east was the pale gold of early April, thin as paper, falling at an angle across that unbroken whiteness so that the shadows of the fence posts ran 40 feet long across the snow. Not a boot print anywhere, not a tire track, just the shape of the ranch as it actually was, underneath everything. I stood in it for a while. I wasn't counting anything. I wasn't planning anything. I was just standing there in the cold that had lost its cruelty overnight and become merely cold again, ordinary cold, the kind you dress for. Then I went inside and found the loan officer's number on the paper I'd folded into the front cover of my farm ledger. I called him from the mudroom phone at 7:07. He answered on the 4th ring, which surprised me. I had expected to leave a message. I told him the count. 297 lambs alive as of first light, April 15th. 3 lost. 2 before I reached them. 1 that had been failing at birth. The flock was intact. The ewes were intact. I had documentation in the barn journal if he needed it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, That's a good number, given the conditions." I said, "Yes, it is." He said he'd note it in the file. I said, "I'd appreciate that." That was the whole conversation. I hung up the phone and looked out the mudroom window at the snow-covered lot and the barn and the thin gold light still working its way across all of it, unhurried, the way light does when it has nowhere else to be. The weeks after a hard night like that, one don't announce themselves. They just come, quiet and gray at first, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes while the north hollows kept their white. Another 2 weeks into May. I moved through those days on a kind of residual momentum. The body still running on the discipline the night had demanded, waking before 5 without an alarm, checking the lot before coffee, counting without meaning to count. The lambs grew the way lambs do when conditions finally relent. Which is to say, quickly, and with an almost indecent health. By the last week of April, they were bouncing off each other in the lot, like the blizzard had never happened. The ewes had held their milk. The numbers in my ledger climbed steady and clean. Average daily gain, fleece condition notes, the slow arithmetic of a flock coming right. I sheared through the first 3 weeks of May with a borrowed Sunbeam handpiece and a neighbor's shearer who drove 4 miles east and charged me 70 cents a head, which I had budgeted for since February, when I'd written the number down in the margin of my grandmother's accounts book. 297 animals, that's $207.90 in shearing fees, and I had it counted out in an envelope in the tackroom drawer before he arrived. The wool came off in good condition, staple length holding, vegetable matter low, because I had watched the feeding all winter the way my grandmother's journal said to watch it. I skirted the fleeces myself in the evenings, sorted by grade, bundled and tagged. The work was slow, and it smelled like lanolin and cold air, and I did not mind it. Word travels in Carbon County the way water moves under winter ice. You can't see it moving, but then suddenly it's somewhere it wasn't before. I hadn't announced anything, I hadn't called anyone, but the feed store in Rawlins is 12 miles up the road, and people talk over the counter while they're waiting for their order to be pulled, and somewhere in those conversations the number got out. 297 lambs through a -6 night. 1 girl, 2 propane heaters, and a wood stove. The first inquiry came by phone on a Tuesday in the second week of May. A buyer out of Sweetwater County, asking about the clip. Asking specifically about the flock. Had heard the wool was clean, had heard the condition was good. I said yes, and I named my price per pound, without hesitating, because I had written that number down 2 months before, when I was still trying to understand what my grandmother had built here, and whether it could still hold. He said he'd come look. The loan officer never called back, not once. Not to check the count again, not to ask about the June payment, not to remind me of the terms. The buyer from Sweetwater County came on a Thursday, drove a white diesel pickup with mud on the panels, and walked the pens without saying much. He looked at the fleeces. The way you look at something you're hoping is exactly what you were told it was. He picked up a lamb by the front legs, checked the hooves, set it down. He asked me how I'd kept condition through the winter on a single-income operation. I told him the truth, carefully and with my grandmother's feed records going back 11 years. He signed that afternoon. 42 cents per pound on the clip, contracted. The buyer from Albany County came the following Monday, and the one from Natrona County 2 days after that. I don't know what they said to each other, or whether they'd talked at all. Maybe they hadn't. Maybe word had just moved the way it does in a place where there aren't that many people, and the ones who exist pay attention. Both of them walked the same pens. Both of them picked up a lamb. Both of them signed. I sat at the kitchen table the evening after the last contract and added the numbers with a pencil, the way my grandmother had done, because I didn't trust a calculator to make it feel real. The total came to more than $9,800. It came to $11,300. $340 if the weights came in as projected, and I had counted and estimated carefully enough by then that I believed the projection. I wrote the figure at the bottom of the column and drew a line under it. The June 1st payment would be met. If you're watching this from somewhere that has ever had a spring like that one, a late blizzard, a bad week, a number on a piece of paper that felt impossible, I'd like to know where you're from. Leave your town and state in the comments. I mean it. That evening I walked the pasture at dusk. The lambs were not lambs anymore in the way they had been in March. They were thicker now, moving like small sheep, covering ground with the easy confidence of animals that had made it through something and didn't know it. I counted them the way I always count them, walking a slow grid, not because I needed the number, but because I had learned from my grandmother that the count is how you stay honest with yourself about what you have. 297. The barn journal went back into the tin box that night. I wrapped it the way I'd found it, in a piece of cloth that had probably been a feed sack once, and I pressed the lid closed until the latch caught. The box went back on the shelf in the tack room. The key went back on its nail behind the feed scale. I left the light on in the mudroom, the way she used to do.